My name is Victor Salkind. This story begins in 1995 with a burial in the forest. What I was burying on that night in June I won't tell you, because I won't be judged by who I was during that time. A scared 22-year-old feeling cornered and making stupid decisions. All you need to know is that it was 4 a.m. I was outside a town called Lavely, Missouri, 30 miles west of where I lived. And only one other person in the world knew why I was there or what I was doing. I'd picked the spot out on a map and thought, here. This seems like a place where no one would ever go. This is where I'm going to do this. After I finished the deed, I was sweating, exhausted. My head was throbbing. I hadn't eaten for 2 days, hadn't slept for 24 hours, sick with worry. There I was, tamping the earth down with a shovel, praying I had done a good job, begging to God to give me the chance to get out of this and make things different. I was about to head back through the woods about a mile to where I left my car beside an agricultural preserve when I heard the sound. My sense of distance and direction was corrupted by the wind and my panic and my disorientation. My first thought was that the sound came from maybe a half-mile away. A tremendous splitting and cracking of wood, but not 1 or 2 trees, no, many of them, dozens maybe, snapping like firecrackers snap, all at once. I almost had a heart attack right there and then, I swear it, at age 22. It went on for 10 seconds, and then it ended very suddenly. I thought, Jesus, they're doing construction on something nearby, of all places, but it just couldn't be. I was in the middle of nothingness. Whatever it had been, I realized, did not matter. I just had to get out of there. I'd done too much already out there to suddenly improvise. So I took my shovel and I bolted. I could visualize emerging from the woods on the other end to see the police waiting for me. But I was okay. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove with trembling hands back to Northcutt Road, and then on to Route 181, toward home, to begin the most awful time yet. The time of waiting, always looking over my shoulder, always believing I was just moments away from being arrested or getting a call with a request that I kindly come down to the station to offer some information about something. That time was made so much worse by the memory of that sound. I scanned the papers for any kind of news about that area, but there wasn't any. I imagined trees bursting, sending splinters everywhere. If there was construction, there was construction. I wouldn't go back. To go back meant risking being seen. I could have tried to do a loop around the forest in the car, but the map showed me it would have been so wide I wouldn't be able to learn anything. Waiting was my only option. And yet, like I said, I was young and dumb. And I reached a point of such paralyzing stress that I felt I was going to bust apart. And so, 12 nights after the burial, I went back to the woods. I filled a backpack with water and snacks and a tent to make it look like I was camping if I happened to come across anyone. If I could just find out what had caused that freaky disturbance, I wouldn't even go back to the burial site. I only needed a little peace of mind. At 2:15 a.m. on a Sunday night, I drove to Dexton and left my car in the parking lot of a Kennemore's grocery, one bigger than the one where I was working then, back in Adelphus. That place was just another reminder of my wasted life in a backward town where seemingly everything was owned by one despicable miser everyone hated, Kirk Kennemore. Anyway, I walked 1 mile down Imperial Road, just over the Lavely town line, and then entered the forest from the west. I had 3 different maps of the area and an old compass, so as not to get lost in that vacant stretch 4 miles across at its widest point. There wasn't even a single trail. I kept telling myself I shouldn't be there, but I kept walking. I didn't really need my flashlight, thank God. The moon was full, but I brought it anyway. It sounds strange, but when I'd been out there 2 weeks before, I'd been so fixated on being fast in my work and getting away that I hadn't felt any trepidation toward the woods themselves. Now, though, that my only goal was exploration, that old, dim, primal fear came back to me. The unknown. I remember jumping across one tiny stream and splashing across another that was a little too wide to hop across. My chances of coming across the actual spot where the sound had originated were not great, I knew. But I figured if there was something big enough going on out there to be worried about, something that might encroach on the burial site, I'd see something. I'd come across some kind of sign. I stopped every 5 minutes in the woods to check my compass. In the dark, it was tough not to veer off little by little. I had to keep making adjustments. You could bend left around a deadfall or a slope that looked like it might twist an ankle, and think you'd corrected yourself beyond it, only to find you'd screwed up far more than you thought. I have my grandfather to thank for what few outdoors skills I had. 2 miles it was until I came across the clearing, very suddenly. Stepped right into it and almost broke my foot. That's because the area was sunken, a full 10, 12 inches lower than the land around it. What was obvious from the start was that something had brought the trees down in an area about 50 yards across, but it was more than that. First of all, the trees hadn't just been cleared, they'd been flattened. Entirely flattened, as if a great weight had come down and smashed them into tiny remnants and splinters, and then pressed the earth down so intensely that the ground had sunken in all around. The perimeter of the area was clean. What I mean by that was that there was no point where any kind of vehicle could have entered the area on the ground. No trails, no cleared routes, no matter how thin. Something had come only from above, on a straight or near straight vertical descent, and done all this. I explored the area, stepping very carefully. Every footstep came down on another patch of flattened, cracked wood, impacted branches and leaves so smoothly pressed, it was almost like walking on a bumpy carpet. My flashlight saved me from one very bad step indeed. Toward one corner of the clearing there was a deep, deep gouge in the earth, about 3 feet across. In the 2 weeks since I assumed it had happened, there'd likely been some rain, and it had filled in some. There was one more of these gouges, too, I'd find out, on the other side of the clearing. A hole, like something heavy and big and sharp had been driven into the ground, like a giant tooth or a claw. If I'd sat down beside it, I could have thrown my feet over the edge, and I wouldn't be able to see the bottom in the dark. Only by shining the flashlight directly down into it could I see its endpoint, far below my feet. I got down on my hands and knees and looked more closely at the timber all around. Nothing visually curious about it, but it definitely had an odd smell, almost like hickory smoke, kind of autumnal, but it was entirely the wrong season to be smelling that. And there was something more to it, almost an alcohol smell underneath. Unplaceable. Squirrels or something moved through the woods all around, each movement unnerving me a little bit more. I checked my best map with the flashlight. It made sense that this was the place where the sound had come from. I went even deeper into the woods, looking around for another anomaly. Only one more half-mile I went, and then I simply became too scared to keep looking. For no rational reason, I avoided the clearing on the way back. I was strangely out of breath by the time I got to that tiny stream, the one I had to splash through to get to the other side. Before I started across it this time, some kind of liquid dripped down on my neck from high above. I thought it was rain at first, but then there came that smell of hickory smoke and alcohol. I wiped the drops away and sniffed them. It was powerful, that aroma up close. I looked up. The treetops were just a little too high for me to see anything up there but smudges against the deep dark blue sky. I had taken all of one step into the trickle of stream when I heard a rustling from above, way above. There was nothing unique about that sound. It was like any kind of large bird or creature moving from one treetop to the other, except whatever was up there sounded bigger than that. I waited for it to come again. It didn't. I started walking again and broke into a jog as soon as I felt sure I wouldn't go too fast and trip over anything or run into a tree. I came out of the woods eventually, and there was the parking lot behind the hardware store behind which I'd gone in 2 hours before. A story for the bar sometime, I thought, as I made my way back to Imperial Road, and eventually my car at Kennemore's Grocery. A story for when this disaster was decades behind me. I read more about that area of the county in the next 2 weeks than I had read about anything all my life. And the sum of it all was nothing. No reports of any disturbances in those woods. Not in the police blotter, not online, such as the internet was back in 1995. It somehow seemed like I was the only one who'd heard what I heard and seen what I'd seen. Or if someone else had, they didn't let it affect them. Of the entire experience, the one thing that got stronger as the days went on, more vivid than even that smell, was that rustling of the trees far above my head before I'd gotten out of the woods as fast as I could. In the end, my paranoia about my circumstances finally consumed me. I sold off almost everything I owned and started going to my shifts at the grocery store with everything I needed to live stashed in my car, ready to blow out of town at a moment's notice. On July 7th, at about 10:30 at night, I noticed an orange light on my answering machine. The message was from a guy named Walter. He said he was feeling torn up about the deal we'd made, and he needed to talk to me. I panicked. I drove out to Barntop, about 4 miles outside of Laveley, where I was sure I'd know no one. I stopped at a place called the Shady Corner, a cruddy little sports bar by the side of Duncan Road, with a parking lot so full of potholes. I left my car on the lot of some unmarked warehouse across the street in order to preserve my wobbly tires and shaky muffler. I needed to eat something, calm down, and think if there was one last way I didn't have to run. I had Walter's number in my back pocket, and I sat in the bar watching baseball and eating wings and sweating over the decision. The clock ticking. The place closed at 2. At 1:50, I made the call to Walter. He told me he'd been going to church for the last few weeks. Then he'd rented a movie called Winter Light, one of those subtitle movies, he called it. And he'd watched it, and now he couldn't stop thinking about God. That was the end of it all. That was when I knew he was going to fold on me. I hung up 2 minutes before the Shady Corner closed. I was the only customer left in the place. I needed to break for it, to get an entirely new start. I was driving west that night, starting toward San Diego, as far away from my stifling Midwestern life as I could imagine. I just wanted to play guitar in dive bars and not dream. When I got to the parking lot across the street, my car was gone. I had that moment of total panic when I thought it had been stolen, but then I noticed these two signs about 10 yards apart, very near the warehouse. No public parking. Violators will be towed. I couldn't believe it. The warehouse was dark except for one or two lights on the upper floor. Night shift, maybe. Someone just being vindictive. Back across the street, the bartender was coming out the front door of the shady corner and locking it. I ran over to him, furious and panicked. He was sympathetic but not surprised. He knew that the lumber warehouse was ridiculously mean about towing. Customers of the bar kept parking there. I wanted to hit something, break their windows. The bartender did know exactly where my car would have been taken. The impound lot was about 3.5 miles away, down Pruitt Road. I asked him if there was any chance he could give me a lift, but he pointed to his 10-speed locked to the side of the building. I was 25 miles away from the room I rented. I wasn't going to get a cab back and forth, and I wasn't about to somehow find a motel out here for 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Everything I owned was in that car. I decided to walk to the impound lot, and by God, I'd sleep right outside the fence if it wasn't open. And I'd be there the second it was. It was only 1.25 miles or so to the turn onto Pruitt. Not a single car went by in all that time. Barntop wasn't even a town, really. I walked right down the double yellow line, still fuming. Pruitt cut sharply into the woods. It was a winding road with no shoulder, unpopulated, no hunting signs instead of speed limit signs. And it was dark. The tree cover was pretty thick. If I looked down at my feet, I could barely see them. The crickets were loud. They wouldn't shut up. I had a pretty good layer of sweat going when I finally saw a break in the dark up ahead, but as I got closer to it, the road bending gradually to the west, I got a little disoriented. I was looking at a massive patch of gray that grew and grew in my vision, and suddenly I felt a little bit cooler. It was fog. I must have been close to the Ponchatoula River. My visibility went down to almost nothing for a few minutes. I kept my eyes focused on one little pinprick of artificial light in the far distance. Without it, I would have been almost completely blind. The road bent sharply left and continued, but I had no need to follow it. I was at the impound lot. A long chain-link fence emerged in the fog, which was not as thick here. I saw the outline of the main building ahead, more of a shack. That single light I'd used as a beacon was over its door. But the place itself was totally in shadows, shut down. I was able to read the sign on the front gate. The place was actually an auto graveyard that also happened to lease some of its acreage to the county for impound use. Kennemore's Auto Salvage. Of course, the stuff that guy owned extended everywhere. Looking past the chain-link fence, I saw that the lot was situated on an enormous field that sloped down gradually from this high point. I'd never seen anything like it. Rows and rows and rows of junked cars as far as I could see, many of them almost crushed. Windows broken, tires flat, jagged lines going all the way to the horizon, disappearing into the fog. Each wreck having its own sad story that no one cared about. Strangely, the gate seemed to be unlocked. I pushed on it, and it budged, heavy as hell, but open. And right away I saw what I could do. I could conceivably find my car somehow and maybe if no one was really around and they hadn't booted the thing, I could drive it right out of there. Like I said, I was 22 years old, full of dumb beliefs, always thinking I knew more about how things worked than I did. I went in, slipping through the gate and pushing it back into place quickly. The area was encircled by a dirt loop, so I took that, headed down the very gradual slope, just guessing at first about which direction to go. There seemed to be more land that way. I was assuming there would be a special section for impounded cars. At first it was just acres of junk, but perfectly orderly, with each wreck having its place in one of the endless lines marching away. I felt like I was a tourist at Gettysburg or someplace like that, looking out over a huge battlefield where thousands of soldiers lay dead. Some of the cars had been beaten to a pulp. There were shattered windshields, hoods and roofs sheared away in what might have been horrific accidents. The sheer distance I covered, the sheer enormity of that place. The fog kept what lay ahead of me always a little bit hidden. Woods sprung up again beyond the gate to my left, and I saw a stretch of them ahead in the ravine I was headed for. So there was an endpoint, finally, up there somewhere. I passed a sign on the chain-link fence that said, "Impounded Vehicles," with an arrow. I was headed in the right direction. I froze suddenly when I saw an anomaly about 50 yards away, down one of the rows of cars, a shape that didn't make sense. It was a human shape. Someone standing there. Just as I spotted it, it moved farther away, walking in the other direction, just beyond the reach of my vision. Instinctively, I crouched where I was. Then I crab-walked close to the nearest car to me, a van with 2 flat tires, and I stayed there, thinking. I'd thought about the possibility of being spotted, even chased away, but I was sure I could play dumb well enough to avoid anything worse. So I stood up, and summoning my nerve, I kept going. But I weaved among the cars now, cutting between the columns for some cover, always hyper-aware of the huge stretch of open land on my right side, watchful for the slightest movement. There was no real divide between the wrecks and the 6 or 7 rows of cars that seemed like they'd been towed there temporarily. Now I set about trying to find mine. As I moved along, I bent over at the waist uncomfortably, trying to keep low. My car was as far away from the main building as could possibly be, placed neatly in the very last row to the north, on the end of a row, just 20 yards or so from the tall fencing that bordered the woods beyond. I was truly in the armpit of the county. I opened my car and got in. I'd wait a few minutes to start it, keeping low and out of sight, biding my time, hoping that whoever was strange enough to be in this lot at this hour would leave. I thought I could do it, that this would actually work. I just couldn't wait too long. For all I knew, that guy I'd seen had a key and could lock me in. And now there was rain, just a little at first, a few drops hitting the windshield, a drizzle. Indecision caused the minutes to tick away. 10, 20. I was so tired. And then I turned my head just so, and I saw something. There was a man sitting in a nearby car. We were separated by only one in between us. He was in the front seat in the dark, looking straight ahead. I held my breath and I slumped down fast so I could just see out the windshield as the intermittent spits of rain began to coat it. Then I heard a car door open and close farther down. 2 different people then, at least 2. At 3:30 in the morning in the farthest corner of an impound lot in the middle of nowhere. Before I could even start to think about what to do, I sensed a splash of faint light happen beyond my windshield. I inched up a little to see through the steering wheel. 4 cars down on the right, someone had turned on a pair of headlights. It lit up the fence and the small patch of grass and dirt before it. The rain looked heavier in that yellow glow than it seemed from inside my car. I counted 3 silhouetted heads in 3 different cars to my right, all in the same row I was, the very last one to the north. Men staring forward through their windshields. Someone emerged from the dark out there, someone pushing an oversized wheelbarrow into the patch of weak light. 2 people, actually, heads ducked against the drizzle. The wheelbarrow contained some tarp-covered parcel too big for it, so the men had trouble with the weight and each had control of one of the handles, coordinating carefully. They settled the wheelbarrow in the light. The details of what they looked like evaded me. The windshield was just too wet. When I looked cautiously to my right again, 2 of the drivers had turned on their wipers. 2 other men were approaching the grassy stage from the left. One was wearing a parka, the other nothing at all to protect against the rain. He had thick, red hair, that much I saw, and I'd say he was over 50. As the wheelbarrow handler stood by, the man in the parka stood over the wheelbarrow and took something out of his belt. I had to turn on the wipers now or I'd be able to see nothing. The blade started back and forth, giving me good split-second glimpses of the scene alternating with murky indistinction. It looked like a needle the man was holding in his right hand, a syringe. The red-haired man pulled on one of the corners of the tarp, exposing the wheelbarrow's contents. But I was at a bad angle. I could only make out some misshapen lump. The man in the parka inserted the needle into some calculated spot and then hesitated there, likely waiting for the contents of the syringe to be guided into that mass. Finally, he stepped away. The red-haired man put a hand on his side and nudged him out of the sight line of those watching from their cars. Some part of the thing in the wheelbarrow stirred. The red-haired man held onto the back of the wheelbarrow, steadying it on one side, while one of the handlers did the same with the handlebars. I couldn't hear anything but the rain. I was detecting something in the air, though, a noticeable change in odor. And I cracked the driver's side window just a tiny bit. A faint hickory smoke smell mixed with alcohol. Real faint, yeah, but unmistakable. Suddenly the wheelbarrow rocked, despite the best efforts to keep it steady. Through the eddies of rain on the glass before me, I saw something rise from it. Something long and dark, a part of the whole thing. The men moved swiftly closer. With no hesitation, one of the handlers had a pistol out, and he held it very close to the mass, and there was a single weak crack that cut through the sound of the rain. Whatever appendage had been emerging from the wheelbarrow came back down. There was a burst of activity as the handlers and the needle bearer brought the tarp back up and over the thing in the wheelbarrow. And then it was being clumsily pushed away back into the dark. The red-haired man alone remained. And in my efforts to slowly see a little more, I had raised my head level with my steering wheel. And now when I turned to the right, the man 2 cars down was looking in my direction. Right at me. I'd been spotted. But he nodded at me, as if he thought I was just another invited spectator. Engines were started. More headlights came on, showing me that at least 7 or 8 cars had been witness to this deranged demonstration. The red-haired man began to walk up one of the columns toward the south and out of sight. It was only then that I believed I was certain who he was, based on half-remembered glimpses in the local paper. Kirk Kennemore. The cars were beginning to move, bumping gently over the smooth grass. I started my engine too. I thought the safest thing for me to do was follow, and then split off as soon as I got out onto the road. One by one the cars moved onto the dirt loop next to the fence and turned left, starting on a path that would slowly climb the slope toward the main building. I joined the end of the line. The line moved very slowly in the rain, 4 or 5 miles per hour maybe. The car ahead of me had out-of-state plates. In none of them, I don't think, was there a passenger, just a single driver always. The main building emerged in the dark and we were getting close to the exit. But then the line stopped. I kept a good distance away from the car in front of me. Everyone just idled. My heart started to beat faster and faster, and I clenched the steering wheel hard. I was whispering under my breath, "Go, go, go." Here's what caused the snarl. I could see in the ambient glow of headlights that someone was going car to car to the driver's sides, and one by one the drivers were rolling down their windows when it was their turn. This man was giving them something, and only then would they move on. I watched him as he got to the car in front of me, and the window was rolled down. His hand reached in and then withdrew. The car's brake lights went off and it moved forward again. I was next. The man, wearing a green windbreaker, moved forward and stood beside me. I rolled my window down. His hand came in. He was holding a small business card. I took it. Without giving me a second look, he turned and started to run, head down, up the slope, his job done. The line was moving faster. The first cars had now made a right turn beyond the gate, which was being held open. I dropped the card on the passenger seat and tried to keep up. The man holding the gate was very tall, and his was the only face I truly saw. He looked right at me, and his expression told me something very scary indeed, which was that he was confused at the presence of one extra car in that line. But then I was past him, and I had turned like the others out onto Pruitt Road. They all sped up swiftly, and so did I. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the gatekeeper hadn't budged, but now he was speaking into a walkie-talkie. Everyone was driving in the same direction. I followed, waiting for the first to turn off that appeared, but this far out in the country, I had no idea when that would be. The car ahead of me was doing about 35 or 40. I was careful not to fall too far behind as I kept one eye on the rearview mirror. No one followed. Pruitt wound and wound, rose and fell. Sometimes the road was straight enough that I could see that the cars had separated more and more, but everyone's direction was identical. It had to be that way. Finally, there it was, a sign indicating a right turn up ahead. For one moment, I considered going past it and following the line to wherever these men were going. But I lost my nerve. I drifted back several car lengths, and I made a very sudden turn onto something called Cherokee Turnpike, skidding a little, my junky car unable to hold the road well. And then I gunned the engine and took off. It was more or less a straightaway. I got the car up to 60 as fast as I felt safe going in the rain, and the woods flew by me on either side. 5 miles later, I finally felt safe enough to pull over in the lot of an all-night gas station. I kept the engine running, though. I picked up the business card I'd tossed onto the passenger seat and turned on the dome light. Written by hand in blue ink were these words and nothing more. 17 Ellis Lane. Minimum bid $5,000. As the rain kept falling, I found my way to a highway and headed west. Far, far away from whatever secret that address kept. On January 29th, 2017, more than 21 years after my experience at the IMPOUND lot, I was packing my house in Seattle for a move east before an 8-week tour of Europe with my new band. It was a quiet weeknight, and I had put off returning calls and emails to make myself a rare meal and go through my bookshelves, keeping and discarding. I came across an old favorite paperback on songwriting that I'd gotten at a yard sale long ago, and I flipped through it again, reminiscing. There was something wedged between the pages at the halfway point. It was a small business card, a little faded with age. It bore an address and a notation in blue handwriting. I sat on my carpet in my den, lost in thought, turning the card over and over again in my hand. A remnant from an entirely different life. I'd thought about it, of course, over the decades, thought about my crisis back then, too, a lot. I had no reason to fear much of anything from those days now, or so it felt like, anyway. My many mistakes had, miraculously, not followed me into the second stage of my life, where I was a successful touring musician with a name a lot of people knew, more than a little money in the bank, plenty of companionship. Almost no one knew about the troubles of my youth. Some secrets I'd kept to myself entirely. To tell anyone ever about my night at the IMPOUND lot would have been to tell about its context. And that meant questions about my life in Missouri, which could conceivably have made things very difficult for me. Almost no one even knew where I'd spent the years between ages 15 and 22. But now, surely I was free of all that. No harm could come to me now if I simply took some time to really think about that card. And what I could finally do about it, finally. There were some facts I gleaned over the years without trying too hard. For one, Kirk Kennemore, the cynical and corrupt overlord of Belmar County, had died in 2006 of liver disease. Yet a lot of his businesses still bore his name. Once in a great while I eyed the area's news online, but I'd never come across anything having much to do with the incidents I remembered. I was left to my own imagination. And in that imagination, something had come from the sky one night outside of Laveley, and had released something into those woods by accident or design. Something that was captured by someone nearby, or someone who happened to work for someone rich and powerful. A man who saw a profit motive in going not to the police but other people instead. People who might be willing to pay to get a closer look at, or even touch, what had been found. All conjecture on my part, of course, all of it. Late that January night, I went back online and I set the business card beside my laptop. Trying not to think that everything we do on the web is tracked somehow, somewhere, I first searched for the town of Laveley in Google Earth. It was time to walk through the forest again, virtually this time. Even that overhead view, digital representation of those woods, when they first came up on my screen, made me tense up. I'd opened a real door to that past for the first time. Nothing much had changed out there, it seemed like. I scrolled left and right, zoomed in and out, and eventually I was able to locate the agricultural preserve where I'd left my car 22 years ago. before I walked into the woods and out of sight, carrying a shovel and something I needed to bury. A few minutes later, I thought I had located the clearing, only because it was a small rectangle of the woods that was lighter in shade somehow than the surrounding area, a patch of woods that looked much less grown, younger, reformed. I took a sip of bourbon from the glass next to me and went about locating the county impound lot on Pruitt Road. Still there, by God. I dropped myself down to street view, placing myself virtually on the road, standing outside the chain-link fence with the main building beyond it. On the screen, it was a nice sunny day, and the place looked completely harmless. And yes, it was still called Kennemore's Auto Salvage. In my mind, the setting went dark again, and I was watching a man speak into a walkie-talkie in the rain as he got smaller in my rearview mirror. More bourbon, and then, sitting alone in my bedroom, I typed 17 Ellis Lane into the search bar. I was taken quickly south and the camera settled. Ellis Lane was a long, wide-open country road with only occasional houses. 17 was what we called, as kids, a spook house. A 2-story residence that had been abandoned and fallen into disrepair. The sky in the Google Earth pictures of this scene was anything but sunny. These photos had been collected in wintertime, and there was an inch of snow on the ground. A long dirt drive led up to the place, which was a good quarter-mile away from the nearest other house. I shut off my computer. I had the resources and just a brief window of days before my schedule ramped up again. I could slip out of town without raising too many eyebrows. By 1 a.m, I had a course of action, and I made a call to the airlines to book a flight. It was time to solve a mystery. Driving my rental car across the Adelphus town line on February 2nd, I did feel a tremor of unease about being seen here. It was possible I might be recognized by someone, maybe even just a fan, who might relay my whereabouts. It had happened before back in Seattle. Back during the dark time in the mid-90s, my glove box had been stuffed with torn and stained maps. Now the GPS on my phone guided me easily. I had no intention of heading into the woods. I drove directly toward Ellis Lane. I had researched past white pages with the help of a friendly librarian back in Seattle and had found only that the house was connected to the name John White until 1997, at which point it apparently no longer had an owner. Or maybe it still did, but that person had taken steps to remain anonymous. No amount of creative searching brought up the name John White in connection with the town in any meaningful way. It was 2:10 a.m. when I turned onto Ellis Lane and started the last 2 miles of my trip. The road was speckled occasionally with house lights, the very occasional glow in a lower window, but everyone out here was asleep. Number 17 was still there, shuttered and black. I killed my headlights and climbed the drive. My car could probably have been seen by faraway neighbors, but I parked in back, on the grass, to give myself a slightly better chance of going unnoticed. I had a crowbar, a reliable flashlight, and a simple yet I hoped effective cover story if things went bad. It was stupid to be out here, I knew. That self-destructive streak that had almost taken me down more than a few times had re-emerged, but I found myself not caring. I got out of the car, cursing myself for not wearing a heavier jacket, and slipped around the front of the house. Someone in the past had made a half-hearted attempt to board up a high window, and there was a no trespassing sign on the front porch, whose boards looked uneven and rotting, but beyond that, the house didn't seem sealed in any serious way. Just another house in the country that no one really wanted anymore, and it wasn't worth the effort to either sell or tear down, not even for its 2 acres of open land. I returned to the backyard, which sloped away toward a wide, empty valley bordering the woods. It occurred to me that I might have been able to walk to the impound lot on a long, long straight shot if I went that way. The directions seemed to align with it. There was a small back porch. I climbed it, and as quietly as I could, I tried to turn the cold knob on the back door. I went back to the car and slipped the crowbar out of the back seat. Truth be told, it was not my first break-in, though I hadn't done anything like this since I was 20. I had to turn on the flashlight and set it on the porch so I could get a little ambient glow. It took exactly 2 prying motions to pop that so-called lock. I nudged the door inward and picked up the flashlight again. It felt almost as cold inside as out. When I shut the door behind me, I could still see my breath before my eyes, just a little. I explored the interior by flashlight. Judging by the decor of the place, it certainly seemed like there hadn't been much of a feminine or couple's presence in the house. Very little flair or ornamentation. Almost generic art on the walls. Junky, mismatched furniture. Plain wallpaper. No one had bothered to remove things like the TV set, which, like everything else, had a thick coating of dust on it. My steps left visible footprints in every room. Small and identifying objects seemed to have been removed, leaving behind the stuff that could have belonged to anyone. I opened a couple of drawers here and there. Nothing. A few kitchen utensils and dishes were still here. Again, functional and unimaginative. I suppose I was a different type of person. To not just be trespassing in that house in the first place, but to then climb the staircase to the upper floor. That first step I took, that's when I really began to feel the fear of being discovered by someone, either inside or out. But I climbed all the same. The story was similar up top. The bed in the larger of the 2 bedrooms was unmade, but again that layer of dust. It was like there had been an attempt by someone to move out of this place, but maybe it had been hurried and for some reason never completed. Here's what I thought, that someone still owned the house, but had just elected to never come back, to close it up but never let it go. And so it stood. Downstairs again, I felt I had reached a frustrating end point. I had learned almost nothing. Something in particular did bother me. I went back into the small dining room. Why was it noticeably colder in here? I wondered. You could feel it right away. But no draft. I shone the flashlight over the walls more carefully, and it struck me that the presence of a tall, thin cabinet was a little strange, since it had no shelves. No shelves at all. When I stood right next to it, I heard a faint whistling sound. The cabinet was easy to shove a few inches to the right, and behind it I saw an irregularity in the wall. When the cabinet was completely out of the way, there it was, a door, but very, very small. It came up only to my waist. Locked not with a knob mechanism, but with a padlock. Intentionally hidden, maybe. The padlock was fairly stout, but I felt confident in being able to make a little noise. I thought, I came a long way. I need to know. And so I took the crowbar and I hacked away at the copper plate, hoping to gouge the lock out. It took a few minutes, but I got there. There had been just a little too much age, a little too much mold to keep it shut tight. I opened the door and shone the flashlight behind it. Steps, leading down in an unusually tight space, not a regular cellar, more like a secret place. I'd have to crouch down very low just to fit through the door and onto the first step. There were only 6 of them, not a long way down. No handrail. It was really cold down there. I could feel that from where I stood. And I went. Not more than 6 inches of room above my head, no more than a foot on either side of my body to maneuver. I've always been claustrophobic, and those 10 seconds were not pleasant. At the bottom of the steps, the floor was packed dirt, not even cement. I was fully underground now, but I was able to stand fully. My lungs stung a little. The air was stale, but thick somehow, stifling, like it had been bottled up for a long time. Ahead of me, I saw by the flashlight a long corridor, really quite shockingly long and very narrow. The walls on the left and right were old cement, icy to the touch. Again, I was going to have no more than 12 inches on either side of me if I were to proceed, which I did. At the end of the corridor, there was an L corner, bending to the left. Around there, a second stretch appeared, just like the first. There were some objects here and there, stacks of crates filled with paper, some big bags of sand, nibbled at and gouged by mice or rats. Typical basement junk. I moved past it all, kept going. Up ahead was the end of this odd little maze. I played the beam of the flashlight over a big, thick sheet of plastic that had been stretched from floor to ceiling across an aperture. It was a room. There was no other exit. It was the room or turn and leave. I walked the last of the corridor and touched that sheet of plastic. It was fastened to the wood planking above the room with staples. I pulled it back with my free hand and shone the flashlight in. I could make out that the room was about the size of the living room upstairs, pretty big. The floor was actual cement now. And there were objects everywhere. I went in. I want to try to describe the things I saw in the order I saw them. Spartan metal racks were ranked along the far wall, while the other walls were bare. On those racks lay dusty canned goods, distilled water, sacks of flour, again chewed through, small drums of unknown stuff, then tools, and not a few guns. I don't know anything about those, really, but some were obviously automatic weapons. The next thing I became aware of was clothing near my feet. Shoes, pants, a flannel shirt, laid out in the shape of a human being, though there was no human being in them. But then I saw that there was. A skeleton. A corpse, long rotted. Strands of hair still clung to the skull, which lay with its right cheek against the cement. Beside the bones of its left hand, just 6 inches away, was a handgun. Several feet farther in, there was another gathering of human clothing. Another skeleton, this one face up, splayed. Its right arm was outstretched, and its right index finger was still hooked through the trigger mechanism of a shotgun. Its jeans were blackened and torn around the waist, and I realized that the left leg was detached from the rest of the body. There were 4 bodies in there total, spread out around the big room, likely males, judging by the petrified and rat-chewed clothing. All skeletons now, having been decomposed for years, decades. The other 2 did not have weapons on or near them, though there was one more shotgun lying at the room's center, which likely belonged to one of them. The head of one of the skeletons had been crushed. This person had been wearing a t-shirt bearing the Budweiser logo. Half of it had blackened into indistinction. That part had been ripped apart. The last body was pressed awkwardly against one wall, and ancient bloodstains were still visible there. The strange position of the body and the way the head was barely attached to the neck, suggested to me that it had been maybe thrown against it, hard, violently. The rest of what lay on the floor of the cellar was not human, though I can't prove that. 3 larger bodies. These were unclothed. They too had rotted, but not in the same way, because I don't think these organisms were made of what you or I are made of, though they seem to have made an attempt to be. If you were to go to another world, and if you had the knowledge and the ability, maybe you would feel safest and strongest by trying to become like the beings you knew you were going to encounter, so that the atmosphere and the terrain would be bearable, or you could try to move among them without being noticed. But to get that just right would be difficult. There might be a lot of trial and error, and it's possible that you might emerge on that night as a strange approximation of those beings, misshapen, badly proportioned, too weak, or maybe even too strong. Does that make sense? Because that is what I think I saw on the floor. There had been a brutal struggle inside this room, a very quick one. Maybe there had been a winner and a loser, but in the end, nothing had gotten out of here, I don't think. Turning around to leave, I saw that in the wall behind me a wooden door had been cut into the cement, even smaller than the one which led me down here. Bolted. Twice. When I got very close to it, it was clear to me, yes, that there was a certain odor coming from behind that door, which I believe I do not have to describe for you. I did finally scream when I heard something move behind it. Yeah, I screamed, and it wasn't like when you're watching a movie on Shudder or something. No, I think if you had a recording of that scream, you'd hear its pitch go high and low and back to high, and it went on for so much longer than anyone watching a film would even be able to bear. But it did end, and when it ended, I was still somehow standing on the cement in that room among all those corpses, staring at the bolted door. The sound from behind it suggested that more than one thing had moved. The things did not try to rush the door or pound on it, trying to get out. Instead, what they tried to do was speak to me. Not in words like you or I would use, but using the sounds that they had or that they'd manufactured. Still alive after 22 years, they would have to wait for someone else to come and let them out. Can I say that someone had locked them in and drawn bidders to come and take a look? And at some point, greed had turned on that someone or someones. No, I can't say any of that. I can't say the naked things on the floor first came here on the night that I went into the forest to bury evidence that my mother had killed my father, or that they'd moved in the trees high above me as I stood in the woods. I don't know that some or all of them were captured somehow. Last night, I made a long-distance call to my old friend, Walter. 22 years between phone calls. I could almost hear that song, Streets of Philadelphia, playing on the jukebox when I'd called him from the shady corner to try to convince him not to turn us in for what we'd done. Now he's known as Brother Luther, and he lives in Spain. 8 months a year, he doesn't even speak. Over the scratchy line, I told him the story of my return to Missouri, and I said I saw something really bad. And I didn't know if there was any point in telling anyone, and it might hurt my life to do it. Just like back in 1995. Brother Luther told me it had taken him a decade to cleanse himself of the guilt over what we'd done, and he suggested I unburden myself. So, this is that recording.